So how do you make your yarn extra beautiful? Add color, of course. Here's how. So a couple of months ago, I received in my Darn Good Yarn subscription a hank of yarn that was recycled silk, but it was undyed, and they gave me a couple of pieces of food coloring in which to use to dye it. They did have instructions, but I didn't have a lot of faith in the instructions. They were a little scant on details or how to cope if you mess up. So I did some more research. In the research, I found ChemKnit's tutorials on YouTube here. I'll put a link in the description down below for Darn Good Yarns, ChemKnit's, and any other companies that I'm going to say during this video. But I love Rebecca from ChemKnit's because she explains things, what she's doing, the reasons why she's doing them. She's been doing ChemKnit's for over 10 years now, and she is so wonderful, happy, and bubbly. It's hard not to watch her tutorials. And in watching those, I got really excited for actually dyeing some yarn. And so I did. I finally did my Darn Good yarn and I made a scarf out of it, which I don't have here at the moment, but that got me kind of addicted, and there still isn't really one place where you can go to find out about yarn and how to dye it yourself, not in one place. So I figured today I'd go over the basics of how to dye your own animal-based fiber. Now I want to specify this is animal-based fiber, so this is the wools, the alpaca, the cashmere, the silk, anything that's come from an animal. Cellulose fibers, which are the cotton and linen and all the other plant-based fibers, need salt. That's a different system. I'm not entirely sure about how much to use of what kind, and I think they need more of the chemical dyes versus I use food coloring. Also, acrylic, polyester, and all other synthetic fibers don't take dye very well, with the exception of polyamide, which is also known as nylon. So you can try to do acrylic, but chances are it might tint and that's about it, and you're more likely to melt and ruin your fiber before it actually takes on color. But first things first, you need to get some bare yarn. The ideal place for me, at least that I've found, is knitpicks.com, and all you do is you go into their little search bar up in the top right, and you type in bare yarn, and they have a ton of different kinds. I have two of them here that I've actually dyed. This is Stroll Fingering Weight yarn, which is a superwash size 1 yarn, and superwash takes on color really well. The color will strike or bind to the fiber particularly quickly. Now these two, this one and this one, are their Capretta, which is a little bit more expensive, but it's not superwash. It has cashmere. I don't remember if it's superwash, but anyway, it has cashmere in it as well as nylon. And as you can see, it also took up the dye really well. But you want something that's not dyed, or you can even get something that's a natural fiber, but it's already dyed, and you can do what's called over dyeing. Basically, you just dye over the existing dye. And you can actually do that anytime you mess up too. Hey, self-fixing yarn, write that there. Anyway, so once you get your fiber, what you want to do is you want to stick it in a bowl with water for about 20 minutes or so to get it soaked. Now you don't have to do this. It just absorbs the dye a little bit faster. Sometimes you want it to do this and sometimes you don't. It really depends on the effect you want. My recommendation for your first time is to soak it in water. Make sure it's completely covered in water and make sure that it's in a hank. So that's this thing. So you untwist your hank, and Knit Picks pretty much all comes in hanks unless you're getting a blank. And you have it like this. And you just stick it in a bowl with water. If you want the colors to strike really quickly, soak it in water with vinegar. But how much vinegar do you want? Because you're going to need vinegar anyway, because acid is the chemical substance that causes the color to chemically bind to the fiber. So you need some, and it really depends how fast you want the colors to strike, depending on how much you want to use. Now, for this one, I only used about 2.5-ish tablespoons of water in about 8 cups of water. And I did not soak it in, I soaked it in plain water and I added the vinegar later. But if you want something that's going to strike really fast, you can soak it in the vinegar water. And in fact, then you can just use the vinegar in what's called your dye bath. The dye bath is a combination of water and vinegar. You need to make sure you have enough water to completely cover your hank or 2 of yarn that you're going to be using. And you want to make sure there's enough vinegar so that your colors can strike. Now, this is where it becomes an art form, because the less vinegar you use, the more likely your colors are going to break. Now, what's breaking? Well, that is when you take a color, such as purple or green, or anything that's a mixture of 2 colors, because food coloring is not made up of a single color. It is made up of combinations of color molecules. So when you have purple, you don't just have purple, you actually have blue and red. And red strikes the yarn, so it binds to the yarn faster than blue. So what you do, if you want the color to break, is you take only about 2 tablespoons or so of vinegar, and put it in your water, and you have to heat up the water to near boiling. You want it at a simmer, not a full boil. You don't want to damage your fibers, but the heat is required to cause the chemical reaction and to make your colors steadfast. And what you can do is you can take your purple or your green and you can start dipping. That's not what I did here. I actually had a cake and I put it in the purple dye and let it sit there. And what happened was that the reds struck first and then the blue struck later. So all the reds made it to the outside of the cake, and then the blues were able to seep in before they bound to the yarn. And that's how I wound up with this wonderful striping of this yarn. Because yes, some of it's white because no dye was able to reach it. Some of it is a pretty light blue because very little dye could reach it, or a little darker blue. And there are even some pink strands because that's where only the red was able to adhere. So that's one way of doing it. And this is actually one of the easiest ways to see a color break. Now this isn't a broken color. This was intentionally done with red on one end and orange in the other. But once you've got your dye bath boiling with your vinegar in it, then you put your dye in. Now for 1 skein of yarn, I recommend starting at about a 1/4 teaspoon of food coloring. You can always increase, but you can't take out color. So a 1/4 teaspoon to a 1/2 teaspoon for 1 to 2 hanks of yarn. And I actually did this with 2 hanks at the same time, so that way they're matched pair. Then what you do is you take your hank and you just slowly dip it into the dye bath and then pull it back out, and then dip it a little bit further in and pull it out. and dip it just a little further in, and you keep doing this, and you'll see that the color, although it's very dark on the bottom, becomes lighter and lighter until you barely have any color. And then you let it sit in the bath and simmer for about 5 minutes. The heat and the vinegar will work its magic / chemistry, and you'll wind up with color adhered to the yarn. Then if you want, what you can do is you could do what I did, which I pulled this out, let it cool. You don't need to add more vinegar if you're reusing the same bath, but you need to add your second color, and then you can do it on the other side. And that's how I wound up with this gradient yarn. Now, but what if you want something more tonal in nature and you want it to be more solid in color? What you do is you add more vinegar. Start at about 1/4 cup. You can always add more vinegar to make the dye adhere to the yarn faster. And then you start with everything cool and just stick your yarn into the bath while it's cold. Put in your color, make sure it's all stirred up. Don't stir the yarn. That's a great way to make it a knotted mess. And then you turn on the heat, and then you bring it up to a simmer. Let it simmer for about 5 minutes. And then you can always test the water. Now, the way you can tell that all the color is adhered to the yarn, another piece of really cool magic is there won't be any color left in the water. All you need to do is take a spoon, we'll pretend this is a spoon, and you dip it in and pull out a little bit of the water. If it looks like clear water, you've adhered all the dye to your yarn. If there's still a little bit left, and that's when you'll notice the color breaking into its component pieces, you know you can need to let it simmer for a little bit longer. If you've got a little bit of dye left that's just being stubborn and it's already simmered for like 20 minutes or something and it's just not adhering, you're kind of doomed. Just let everything cool off together. It might bind, it might not. But either way, you've done a pretty good exhaust. There is a limit to how much dye can fit into a single hank of yarn. Anyway, by adding your yarn to a cold dye bath and then heating it up, all of your fibers are pretty much equally exposed to the dye for a similar amount of time. So you might have some slight tonal changes, but everything should gather up the dye pretty equally. Then you let everything cool. Regardless of the method you're using, you let everything cool, and you pull your yarn out of the dye bath and you squeeze it out. You never wring out your yarn because that's a great way to stretch it and damage it. But you just squeeze it out, all the water, and then you go to wash it. Now, as you can see, you are likely to, at this stage, tangle your yarn. But if you're really patient and you hold on to your ties, which I have here, you're able to find it, and you're able to find the way that it naturally goes, and you can keep it back into your circle. So you can wash it, use a little bit of hand soap, and make sure it's rinsed thoroughly until there's no dye coming out of it anymore. Sometimes it'll take a while. I notice silk doesn't absorb nearly as much dye as wool does. So if you're doing something that's primarily silk, it'll take a lot more washes versus if you've properly exhausted your dye bath, it'll probably only take a couple of washes and a couple of rinses, and you just want to make sure all the soap is out of the yarn. Then if you want it to feel extra luxurious, put a little bit of hair conditioner in and rinse that out thoroughly, and you're going to have a lovely, amazing skein of yarn. Then you'll want to get as much water out as you can, squeeze it again, or use a salad spinner. Do not put it in the dryer unless you want a complete tangled mess. And then you hang it to dry. Once you're done, you can just twist it into your skein, put it together, and you have a hank of home dyed yarn. So if you like this video, be sure to like it. Also, feel free to subscribe to my channel and hit the notifications icon so that you can be updated every time I post something new. Also, I'm kind of curious as to what you're interested in dyeing next. I know I've got my own plans, but I'd like to hear what's up with you, so go ahead and make a comment. Also, be sure to click some of the links in the description box. Everything I've mentioned in this video is there, and if anything particularly spoke to your heart, I want you to go find that. So, anyway, I hope this helped. Talk to you next week. Bye!